The small Bavarian village of Cailleach lay under a thick, suffocating blanket of snow. Winter had come early and harsh this year, with blizzards sweeping through the forested region, isolating it from the world. On the 13th of December, tragedy struck. A shepherd stumbled upon the village square at dawn, his desperate cries cutting through the freezing air. The townsfolk rushed out, gasping at the sight, a group of 12 people frozen solid, their bodies contorted in fear. Some were mid-stride, others collapsed as though fleeing something unseen. Their skin was pale blue, their expressions locked in terror, their open eyes glittering with frost. The townsfolk were paralyzed by fear, whispering of curses and omens. No storm or natural force could explain the phenomenon, the air had been calm the night before. Local police, overwhelmed by the sheer strangeness of the case, reached out for help. The call was answered by Detective Elric Graves, a man with a reputation for solving crimes others deemed unsolvable. He arrived in Cailleach days later, stepping off a rattling train into the icy stillness of a village gripped by dread. Graves adjusted his long coat and pulled his wide-brimmed hat low, his breath misting in the frigid air. As he approached the square, the villagers parted to let him through. His piercing blue eyes scanned the scene, taking in every detail. 12 bodies stood in unnatural poses, frozen like grotesque statues. A faint, almost imperceptible hum seemed to linger in the air, as though the very ground retained some of the terror that had occurred here. Graves crouched next to the nearest body, the frost on its skin glinting in the pale sunlight. "This wasn't the cold alone," he murmured, his voice quiet but firm. "Something else is at work here." Graves established a makeshift command post in the village's lone inn, where the locals huddled around the hearth, whispering tales of old curses and strange apparitions. He listened intently as a grizzled elder spoke of an ancient legend tied to the region. "She's known as Cailleach," the elder said, his voice trembling. "The Hag of Winter. They say she comes with the first snow, bringing death to those who anger her. We thought she was just a story, until now." Graves leaned forward. "Why would this Cailleach target your village? Did anything unusual happen recently?" The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Graves felt the weight of their silence. He suspected they knew more than they were letting on. "If you want me to stop this, you need to tell me everything," he pressed. Finally, a younger woman spoke up. "There was a ritual," she admitted hesitantly. "The harvest festival. It was smaller this year because of the weather, but the mayor insisted we hold it." Some of the younger men, they mocked the old traditions. They danced around the fire, laughing at the legends. "Mocked her," the elder interjected gravely. "That's when the storm came." Graves frowned. A ritual. Mockery of ancient traditions. These were details he couldn't ignore. The next morning, Graves ventured into the snow-blanketed woods with Franz, the young shepherd who had discovered the bodies. Franz mentioned a shrine deep in the forest, one long abandoned but still whispered about by the villagers. "The elders always said we shouldn't go near it," Franz explained, his breath visible in the freezing air. "It's where the Cailleach is said to sleep during the summer months." But the festival fire, it was lit with wood from the shrine's grove. Graves' sharp instincts told him this wasn't a coincidence. "Take me there," he ordered. The journey was treacherous, the snow nearly waist-deep in some places. As they neared the grove, the air grew colder, the silence oppressive. Finally, they arrived at a clearing dominated by a weathered stone altar. The ground around it was bare of snow, though the surrounding trees were thick with frost. Graves knelt by the altar, running his gloved fingers over the strange carvings etched into the stone. They depicted swirling patterns, interspersed with figures bowing before a towering woman with flowing hair like icicles. The marks were ancient, but the altar wasn't untouched. Recent footprints circled it, and scraps of burnt wood lay nearby. "Someone was here," Graves muttered. "They disturbed it." Returning to the village, Graves began piecing together the events leading up to the tragedy. He questioned the mayor, a nervous man whose hands trembled as he spoke. The festival was meant to honor the old ways, the mayor said. But the younger folk don't respect tradition. They drank too much, shouted at the shadows, even threw snowballs at the old shrine. I tried to stop them, but... He trailed off, guilt etched into his face. What happened the night of the festival? Graves pressed. There was a storm, the mayor said. Fierce and sudden. We thought it was just the weather, but then we heard it, a voice, wailing in the wind. And the next morning, he shuddered. The bodies. Graves' mind raced. A storm. A wailing voice. A desecrated shrine. These pieces fit too neatly into the pattern of an old curse. Graves consulted the village archives, stored in a dusty room beneath the church. Among the brittle pages of handwritten records, he found accounts of similar tragedies, all occurring during harsh winters. Each incident spoke of villagers mocking or neglecting the Cailleach, followed by deaths eerily similar to the ones in Cailleach. One account, dated 1794, described a lone survivor, a woodsman who claimed to have confronted the Cailleach herself. His account detailed a towering figure of ice and shadow, with eyes like frozen lakes. She had spared him, he wrote, only after he knelt and begged forgiveness. Graves stared at the page, his brow furrowed. If the Cailleach was real, then her wrath could only be appeased by restoring the balance that had been broken. As he closed the book, the church bells tolled, their sound carrying through the still air. But beneath the chime, he thought he heard something else, a faint, mournful wail, like wind through a frozen forest. The mournful wail persisted through the night, echoing faintly across Cailleach. The villagers huddled in their homes, terrified of what might come next. Detective Elric Graves stood by the window of the inn, his sharp eyes scanning the snow-covered streets below. The sound wasn't just the wind, it carried an unnatural resonance, a cry of anger or warning. Graves scribbled in his notebook by candlelight, piecing together the timeline. First, the desecration of the shrine. Then the storm, the frozen bodies, and now the wailing. These weren't disconnected events, they were the footsteps of an entity advancing towards something greater. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Franz, the young shepherd, stood pale-faced on the threshold. "There's another one," he stammered. Graves grabbed his coat and followed Franz through the empty streets to a barn at the village's edge. Inside, a man lay frozen in the hay, his arms outstretched as if crawling toward the door. His expression mirrored the others, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. "He went out last night," Franz explained, his voice trembling. "Said he heard his wife calling from the woods. But she's been dead 3 years. Graves crouched beside the body, inspecting the frost that crusted the man's clothes and skin. He muttered under his breath, "It's not just killing them. It's luring them." Back at the inn, Graves gathered the villagers who dared to venture out. "This isn't random," he told them. "Whatever this force is, it's targeting those who disturb it or fall into its trap. It's feeding on fear and grief." The elder, his wrinkled hands trembling, spoke up. "The Cailleach's voice carries the memories of the dead. She calls to them, mimicking their loved ones to draw them into her grasp." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances, some clutching charms and talismans. Graves' gaze swept the room. "We need to break the cycle. Tell me everything you know about the Cailleach. Rituals, offerings, anything." After a long silence, Agath, a woman who ran the apothecary, spoke hesitantly. "There's a story, about an offering. The Cailleach demands respect. A sacrifice of warmth, a flame or a life. If we appease her, she might leave us be." Graves' jaw tightened. He didn't like the sound of that. Determined to uncover more, Graves returned to the shrine at dawn, this time alone. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he ventured deeper into the woods, the trees around him glistening with frost. The air was colder here, unnaturally so, biting into his skin even through his thick coat. At the shrine, he found more clues, strange marks carved into the stone that he hadn't noticed before. He brushed away the snow to reveal patterns resembling concentric circles, intersected by jagged lines. These weren't mere decorations, they were glyphs of power, likely tied to the Cailleach's influence. As Graves studied the markings, a sound broke the silence, footsteps crunching in the snow. He turned sharply, his hand instinctively reaching for the iron dagger he carried. But there was no one there, only the faint impression of footsteps leading away from the shrine and into the deeper forest. With a mixture of caution and curiosity, Graves followed the trail. The footsteps led him to a clearing where the snow seemed unnaturally pristine, untouched by wind or animal. At its center stood a massive block of ice, its surface smooth and glinting like a diamond in the pale sunlight. Encased within was a figure, a woman, tall and ethereal, her flowing hair like threads of silver. Her eyes, though closed, radiated a presence that made the air feel heavier. Graves realized with a shudder that this was the Cailleach herself, slumbering in her frozen prison. Yet the frost spreading outward from the block suggested her power was not entirely dormant. Nearby, he noticed more recent signs of disturbance, boot prints and scorch marks on the ground. Someone had been here, possibly at the time of the desecration. Graves took note of the symbols carved into the ice, similar to those on the altar but more intricate. Before he could examine further, a piercing wail erupted from the forest, louder and closer than before. Graves spun around, heart pounding, as the snow around him began to shift and stir. The ground trembled as the snow coalesced into forms, shadows of wolves with jagged teeth and glowing eyes. The air grew impossibly cold, the frost biting at Graves' exposed skin as he drew his iron dagger. The creatures circled him, their howls harmonizing with the distant wail. Graves knew they weren't natural animals, they were constructs of ice and malice, extensions of the Cailleach's will. One lunged at him, its icy jaws snapping inches from his arm. Graves swung the dagger, the iron blade slicing through the creature like paper. It shattered into a cloud of frost, but the others pressed forward, their snarls growing louder. Graves fought with precision, each strike deliberate. The wolves were fast, but his iron weapon gave him the advantage. When the last of them shattered, the clearing fell silent once more. Breathing heavily, Graves turned back to the ice block. The figure within seemed unchanged, yet the frost spreading from it pulsed faintly, as though responding to the fight. "This isn't just a legend," he muttered. "It's a warning." Graves returned to the village shaken but resolute. The attack confirmed his worst fear, the Cailleach wasn't fully dormant. Her influence was growing, fueled by the desecration of her shrine and the fear-gripping Cailleach. That night, the wailing intensified, and more villagers reported hearing voices outside their windows. Graves set up patrols, instructing everyone to stay indoors and avoid responding to any calls from the forest. But the Cailleach's lure proved powerful. By morning, 3 more villagers were found frozen, their bodies leading in a line toward the woods. The mayor confronted Graves, his face pale with desperation. "This is beyond us. What are you going to do?" Graves met his gaze, unshaken. "I'm going to stop it. But first, I need to understand what she wants." As dawn broke over Cailleach, Detective Elric Graves sought out the village elder, a man named Matthias who had witnessed countless winters but none as deadly as this one. Matthias was reluctant to speak, his eyes avoiding Graves' piercing gaze. "You know more than you're letting on," Graves said, his tone firm but not unkind. "If we're going to stop this, I need every detail, no matter how frightening." Matthias sighed, his hands shaking as he held a steaming mug of tea. "The Cailleach isn't just a spirit or a legend, detective. She's a force, as old as winter itself. And we've broken her balance." "Balance?" Graves pressed, leaning forward. Matthias nodded. "The shrine in the woods isn't just a marker, it's an anchor. Every winter, the elders would perform a ritual to honor her, ensuring she remained dormant. But the ritual requires reverence, not mockery. Those fools at the festival, they shattered the bond. Graves narrowed his eyes. What kind of ritual are we talking about? The elder hesitated, then spoke slowly, as if the words themselves carried weight. It's an offering. Something of warmth, something of life. Only by appeasing her can we hope to end this. The villagers gathered in the church, their faces pale and drawn as Graves explained what he had learned. The elder's words hung over them like a storm cloud, an offering of warmth, an offering of life. What does that mean? Asked a woman clutching her child tightly. A fire? An animal? Or one of us? Graves held up a hand to calm them. We're not jumping to conclusions. The shrine is key, but we need to know exactly how the ritual works. Guessing won't help anyone. He turned to Matthias. The old records, there must be something about the specifics. Where can I find them? The elder pointed toward the back of the church. There's a chest in the archives. It holds the journals of the priests who came before. If the answer exists, it will be there. Graves wasted no time, descending into the cold, dimly lit basement. The chest was weathered but intact, its iron latch creaking as he opened it. Inside were brittle books filled with faded ink. One journal, dated to 1722, detailed a harsh winter much like the present one. The passage he found was chilling. The Cailleach demands the fire of life. To mend her balance, a life must be given freely, with reverence and humility. Without it, her wrath is unending. Graves stared at the page, his mind racing. When Graves returned to the villagers with the journal, panic broke out. The idea of a sacrifice, a human life, was too much for them to bear. This is madness, shouted one man. We can't just offer someone up. We'll all die if we do nothing, countered another. Graves let the argument simmer for a moment before stepping forward. Enough, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. No one is making any decisions tonight. We still have time to find another way. But as the crowd dispersed, one figure lingered near the door. It was Franz, the young shepherd. His face was pale, but his expression was resolute. I'll do it, Franz said quietly. Graves turned to him, his brow furrowed. Do what? The sacrifice, Franz said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. I don't have a family. If it's between me and the rest of the village, I'll go. Graves shook his head. It's not that simple. This isn't about martyrdom, it's about balance. If the ritual isn't done correctly, it won't stop her. Then tell me what to do, Franz said. You've read the journals. You know how this works. Graves placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. Not yet. We'll figure it out. But if we're going to save everyone, we need to understand the Cailleach's intent. That night, the wailing returned, louder and more urgent than ever. Graves barely slept, his mind turning over the grim revelation. In the early hours of the morning, he ventured outside, unable to ignore the pull of the sound. The wind carried a whisper, distinct and chilling, balance, must, be, restored. Graves followed the voice to the edge of the woods, where he stopped abruptly. Frost began to spread from the trees, curling across the ground like grasping fingers. A shape emerged from the shadows, tall and regal, with a presence that froze the air around it. It was the Cailleach herself, her icy form glowing faintly in the dim light. Her eyes, cold and piercing, locked onto Graves. Detective, she said, her voice an echo of winter storms. You seek to undo my wrath. Graves gripped the iron dagger at his side. I seek to end the deaths. Your quarrel isn't with these people. Her laugh was like shattering glass. You know nothing of my purpose. Their defiance broke the pact. Balance must be paid in fire and life. Then take me, Graves said, his voice steady despite the chill clawing at his lungs. The Cailleach tilted her head, her expression unreadable. A willing offer, she said. But your fire burns too strong. I will not take you. Not yet. Before Graves could respond, she dissolved into a flurry of snow, leaving him alone with the frost creeping toward the village. Graves returned to the inn, frost clinging to his coat and hat. He sat by the fire, his mind racing. The Cailleach had rejected him, but her words confirmed what he feared: someone would have to willingly offer their life. Franz approached him again, his expression firm. She spoke to you, didn't she? Graves nodded. Then you know what has to happen, Franz said. Graves shook his head. Not yet. We have to be certain. If we get this wrong, she'll take more than just one life. Franz frowned but said nothing. Over the next hours, Graves combed through the journals again, searching for anything that might offer an alternative. He found a single passage that gave him pause. Fire does not always mean death. Warmth can be given without extinguishing the flame. It was vague, but it offered hope. Graves felt the weight of time pressing down on him. The wailing was growing louder, the frost advancing. He had to act soon. Detective Elric Graves worked late into the night, poring over the journals and notes he had unearthed from the church archives. The cryptic phrase he had found, "warmth can be given without extinguishing the flame," echoed in his mind. The words seemed to suggest an alternative to sacrifice. Could the balance be restored without death? Graves wasn't sure, but he clung to the hope they offered. The frost creeping closer to the village told him time was running out. Outside, the wailing had become a near-constant presence, louder and more urgent with each passing hour. The villagers, terrified and exhausted, barricaded themselves in their homes, unwilling to face what they saw as inevitable doom. Graves leaned back in his chair, staring at the flickering fire in the hearth. Fire. Warmth. Life. The pieces were there, but he hadn't put them together yet. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Franz entered, his face pale but determined. You found something, Franz said, not a question but a statement. Graves nodded. Maybe. There's a passage in the journals that hints at another way, a way to give warmth without giving a life. But I don't know what it means yet. Franz stepped closer, his voice low. I'll do whatever it takes. Just tell me what to do. Graves frowned, the weight of the young man's words pressing on him. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. The next morning, Graves set out for the shrine again. He needed to study the altar and its carvings more closely, hoping they would offer further insight into the ritual. Franz insisted on accompanying him, carrying a bundle of firewood and a flask of oil as a precaution. The forest was eerily quiet, the snow beneath their boots crunching loudly in the stillness. As they approached the clearing, the air grew colder, the frost thickening around them. The altar stood as they had left it, but the area felt alive, as if the ground itself were watching them. Graves knelt by the carvings, tracing the jagged patterns with a gloved hand. He noticed something he hadn't before, a central symbol, etched deeper than the others. It resembled a flame surrounded by spirals, each line radiating outward like the sun. Fire, Graves muttered. It's all connected to fire. Before he could study it further, the wailing intensified. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing, followed by another. Then another. Graves stood, his hand going to the iron dagger at his belt. Franz, get back. The snow around them began to rise and swirl, forming into shapes, figures of ice and shadow, their glowing eyes fixed on the pair. They're coming. Franz shouted, gripping a torch. The icy figures surrounded the clearing, their forms shifting and unnatural. They resembled humans, but their movements were jagged and stilted, like puppets controlled by invisible strings. Graves brandished his iron dagger, standing protectively in front of Franz. Stay behind me. If they get close, use the torch. One of the figures lunged forward, its claw-like hand slashing through the air. Graves met it with the dagger, the blade slicing cleanly through the creature. It dissolved into a burst of frost, but another immediately took its place. They're endless. Franz yelled, lighting the torch and waving it to keep the creatures at bay. Graves' mind raced. The altar, the carvings, the flame. It all pointed to the same conclusion: the shrine itself was a focal point for the Cailleach's power. If they could disrupt it, they might weaken her influence. Franz, the oil! Graves shouted. Franz fumbled with the flask, pouring it over the wood he had brought. Graves grabbed the bundle and threw it onto the altar, striking a match to ignite it. Flames roared to life, their heat pushing back the advancing frost. The icy figures hesitated, their forms flickering. The wailing grew louder, almost pained, as the fire consumed the altar. As the flames reached their peak, the clearing was filled with a deafening roar, as if the very earth were crying out in protest. The icy figures dissolved into mist, leaving only silence in their wake. But the victory was short-lived. The air grew colder than ever, a bone-deep chill that made it hard to breathe. From the heart of the fire, a figure began to emerge. The Cailleach stepped forward, her form towering and regal, wreathed in frost and shadow. Her eyes burned like frozen stars, and her presence was suffocating. "You think fire can stop me?" she said, her voice a thunderous echo. Graves stood his ground, though his heart pounded in his chest. "We're not trying to stop you. We're trying to understand." The Cailleach tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Understand? Mortals like you cannot comprehend my nature. You broke the pact. You must pay the price." "Then tell me what the price is," Graves demanded. "What do you want?" Her eyes narrowed, and the frost around her swirled like a storm. "Balance. Warmth for the cold. Life for the death." Graves stepped forward, his voice steady despite the freezing air. "You said it yourself, mortals broke the pact. But mortals can restore it." The Cailleach studied him, her gaze piercing. "You offer much, detective. But words alone will not suffice." "I'm not offering words," Graves said. "I'm offering a deal. If it's warmth you need, let us restore it. A flame, not a life." The Cailleach's expression didn't change, but the storm around her stilled slightly. "You test my patience. Speak clearly, or be silent." Graves gestured to the fire on the altar, its flames still burning brightly. "You don't need blood. You need reverence, respect. Let us rebuild the shrine, restore the rituals. We'll honor the pact without death." For a long moment, the Cailleach said nothing. Then, slowly, she stepped closer, the frost at her feet crackling with each step. "You think you can restore what has been broken," she said. "Then prove it." The Cailleach loomed over the altar, her icy gaze fixed on Detective Elric Graves. The fire still burned brightly, but its warmth felt distant, overwhelmed by the chill emanating from her. "Prove your worth, mortal," the Cailleach said, her voice resonating like cracking ice. "Show me the flame that can balance my wrath." Graves felt the weight of her words, their layered meaning clear. This wasn't just about fire, it was about intent, humility, and the ability to mend what had been broken. He turned to Franz, who stood frozen in place, gripping the torch tightly. "Franz," Graves said calmly, "we need more wood for the fire. We'll build it higher, brighter." Franz hesitated but nodded, running back toward the edge of the clearing to gather branches from the snow-covered forest floor. Meanwhile, Graves approached the altar, his breath visible in the freezing air. "This fire isn't just for warmth," Graves said, his voice steady. "It's for recognition. A reminder of the balance we've upset and our responsibility to restore it." The Cailleach tilted her head, her cold eyes narrowing. "Words mean little without action. Feed the flame, or it will wither." Graves worked quickly, piling more wood onto the fire as Franz returned with armfuls of branches. The flames roared higher, their heat pushing back the frost creeping across the ground. The wailing that had plagued the village for days began to soften, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the very earth. As the fire burned, the Cailleach raised a hand, and the storm around her subsided. The frost on the ground stopped advancing, and the oppressive chill in the air began to ease. "You have kindled the flame," she said. "But a fire without devotion is hollow. Speak, detective, what will you offer to maintain this balance?" Graves hesitated, the weight of her question pressing down on him. He glanced at Franz, who watched anxiously from the edge of the clearing. "My life is yours, if that's what it takes," Graves said, his voice resolute. Franz gasped, stepping forward. "No. It should be me. I." The Cailleach silenced him with a glance, her icy gaze cutting through the air like a blade. "The fire is not sustained by death," she said. "It is sustained by respect, by commitment. You offer your life too easily, detective." She stepped closer to Graves, her form towering over him. "But you are different. You seek understanding, not domination. Perhaps, there is hope for balance." The Cailleach extended her hand, palm open and wreathed in frost. "The shrine will be restored. The pact will be renewed. But know this, mortal, my favor is fleeting. If you or your kind fail to uphold your end, my wrath will return tenfold." Graves nodded, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers. "We'll honor it. I'll make sure of it." The Cailleach turned to Franz, her voice softening slightly. "And you, young one. Your flame burns brightly. Tend to it carefully, for it is fragile." Franz swallowed hard, nodding. "I will." With a wave of her hand, the Cailleach extinguished the fire on the altar. The frost retreated, and the air grew still. The storm that had plagued the village for weeks began to dissipate, the clouds parting to reveal the faint light of dawn. Before fading into the shadows, the Cailleach spoke one final warning: "The balance is yours to keep. Do not let it falter again." By the time Graves and Franz returned to Cailleach, the wailing had ceased entirely. The villagers emerged cautiously from their homes, their expressions a mixture of fear and relief. The frost that had choked the streets and buildings was melting, and the oppressive chill in the air was lifting. Graves stood in the village square, addressing the crowd. "The Cailleach's wrath has subsided, but only because we've made a promise to restore what was broken. This shrine, this ritual, these aren't just superstitions. They're part of your history, your survival. You must honor them." The villagers nodded solemnly, their respect for the ancient traditions renewed. As the sun rose over Cailleach, Graves prepared to leave. Franz approached him, his face still pale but determined. "Thank you," Franz said. "For everything." Graves tipped his hat, a faint smile on his lips. "The real work begins now. Keep the flame alive, Franz. It's in your hands." With that, Graves set off toward the train station, his long coat billowing in the cold breeze. He knew this wasn't the last time he'd face something ancient and dangerous. But for now, he left Cailleach knowing he had restored balance, for a time.